Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. We are from Group 6. My friends Dimas Rezi Maulana, Mairada Taskia Ibrahim, and Muhammad Irsyad Al-Fatih, and me, Adga Junior, will trying to explain the rise of the English-speaking world 1815 to 1870. First, the years following Britain's victory in the Napoleonic Wars were a period of expansion for the United Kingdom and its former American colonies, which now made up the United States. The period of expansion would help establish Anglicanism as the dominant religion, English as the dominant language, and Anglo-American culture as the dominant culture of two continents and many other lands outside the British. Next, Industrial Revolution in the English-speaking world. Possibly the greatest change in the English-speaking world and the West as a whole following the Napoleonic War was the Industrial Revolution. The revolution began in Britain, where Thomas Newcomen developed a steam engine in 1712 to pump seeping water out of mines. This engine at first was powered by water, but later other fuels like coal and wood were used. Steam power had first been developed by the ancient Greeks, but it was the British that first learned to use steam power effectively. In 1804, the first steam-powered railroad locomotive was developed in Britain, which allowed goods and people to be transported at faster speeds than ever before in history. Soon, large number of goods were being produced in factories. This resulted in great societal change, and many people settled in the cities where the factories were located. Factory work could often be brutal. With no safety regulation, people become sick from contaminants in the air in textile mills, for example. Many workers were also horribly maimed by dangerous factory machinery, since workers relied only on their small wage for sustenance. Entire families were forced to work, including children. This and other problems caused by industrialism resulted in some reform by the mid-19th century. The economic model of the West also began to change, with mercantilism being replaced by capitalism, in which companies and later large corporations were run by individual investors. New ideological movements began as a result of the Industrial Revolution, including the Luddite movement, which opposed machinery, feeling it didn't benefit the common good, and the Socialists, whose belief usually included the elimination of private property and the sharing of industrial wealth. Unions were founded among industrial workers to help secure better wages and rights. Another result of the revolution was a change in societal hierarchy, especially in Europe, where nobility still occupied a high level on the social ladder. Capitalists emerged as a new powerful group, with educated professionals like doctors and lawyers under them, and the various industrial workers at the bottom. These changes were often slow, however, with Western society as a whole remaining primarily agricultural for decades. Next, United Kingdom. From 1837 until 1901, Queen Victoria reigned over the United Kingdom and the ever-expanding British Empire. The Industrial Revolution had begun in Britain during the 19th century. It became the most powerful Western nation. Britain also enjoyed relative peace and stability from 1815 until 1914. This period often called the Pax Britannica, from the Latin British peace. This period also saw the evolution of British constitutional monarchy, with the monarch being more a figurehead and symbol of national identity and the actual head of state, with that role being taken over by the Prime Minister, the leader of the ruling party in Parliament. Two dominant parties emerging in Parliament in this time were Conservative Party and the Liberal Party. The Liberal constituency was made up mostly of businessmen, as many liberals supported the idea of a free market. Conservatives were supported by the aristocracy and farmers. Control of Parliament switched back and forth between the parties during the 19th century, But overall, the century was a period of reform. In 1832, more representation was granted to new industrial cities, and laws barring Catholics from serving in parliament were repealed. Although discrimination against Catholics, especially Irish Catholics, continued, other reforms granted near universal manhood suffrage, and state-supported elementary education for all Britons. More rights were granted to workers as well. Ireland had been ruled from London since the Middle Ages. After the Protestant Reformation, the British establishment began a campaign of discrimination against Roman Catholic and Presbyterian Irish, who lacked many rights under the penal laws, and the majority of the agricultural land was owned by the Protestant ascendancy. Great Britain and Ireland had become a single nation ruled from London without the autonomous Parliament of Ireland after the Act of Union of 1800 was passed, creating the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland. In the mid-19th century, Ireland suffered a devastating famine which killed 10% of the population and led to massive emigration.
British Empire 1815 until 1870. Interpretation of the British Empire have changed and developed over time. In the 19th and early 20th century, some historians argued that the empire was the deserved result of Britain's technical and moral superiority. They argued that British rule established formal system of government, law and education, as well as the development of infrastructure like railways. Britain was heavily involved with the transatlantic slave trade in the 17th, 18th and 19th centuries. The British Empire also stripped many colonized and indigenous people of their land and vibrant cultures, for example, the Aboriginal in Australia and the indigenous people of the United States. Background: Britain in the Middle Age. The British Empire did not exist in the Middle Age. In the early Middle Age, England was part of other empires. In 1066, William of Normandy conquered England. Other lands conquered by the Normans include part of the south of Italy and North Africa. During the reign of Henry II, England was part of the Angevin Empire, which included Ireland and most of western France. To increase their wealth and power, medieval kings tried to take over ever wider lands. Sometimes this could be achieved through marriage, however sometimes kings should have to go to war. During the Middle Age, the King of England tried to conquer other countries. In 1169, the Normans invaded Ireland. In 1171, Henry II went to Ireland to make sure that their conquests were made part of his Angevin Empire. In the year that followed, about half of the island was overrun by Normans, English, and Welsh. In 1277, Edward I invaded and conquered North Wales. During the Hundred Years' Wars, from 1337 until 1453, Edward III and Henry V captured large areas of France, but by 1453, the only land still in English hands was Calais, now in France, which was later lost in 1558. By 1500, the King of England had lost control of all of Ireland except for coastal towns and an area around Dublin known as the Pale. The First British Empire, from 1497 until 1763. Between 1497 and 1763, English seamen reached places Europeans had not previously been. Britain then set up colonies and used them to trade all over the world. However, the British used violence to take over this land. Many people were enslaved as a result of expansion of the empire. In 1497, only 5 years after Christopher Columbus sailed to the Caribbean, the Italian explorer John Cabot, with the approval of Henry VIII and financed by English merchants, reached Canada. The first English colonies were formed in North America in 1585. Sir Walter Raleigh organized a small settlement, Roanoke in Virginia, but it failed, and in 1607 the Virginia Company founded a permanent colony at Jamestown in Virginia. After 1612, the East India Company began to build up a small empire of trading posts in India. The first English colonies in the Caribbean were founded in 1620s. Colonialization of St. Kitts began in 1623 and then expanded to islands including Barbados and Antigua. English planters learned how to grow sugarcane and make sugar from the Dutch, who had learned from their colonies in Brazil. The production of sugar needed lots of workers, and the English began to increasingly use enslaved labor. In 1655, the English invaded Jamaica, which had previously been a colony of Spain. Jamaica formally became a British colony in 1670. In 1664, the English took over the Dutch colony of New Netherland, which included the state of New Amsterdam. The English renamed this New York. The English also took over New Sweden, which now called Delaware. Florida, previously a colony of Spain, formally became a British colony in 1763. Fighting the French and gaining control of India. During the 18th century, the British were heavily involved in the transatlantic slave trade. The British were responsible for the enslavement of millions of West Africans to work on Caribbean farms and sugar plantations. In addition, the 18th century saw Britain fighting a number of wars against France and taking over colonies established by the French. In 1730, British took over the French colony of Acadia, New France in northeastern North America. Victories by Robert Clive, including the Battle of Plassey in 1757, drove out the French and established British control in India. During the 7 Years' Wars, from 1756 until 1763, the British won Canada from the French, with a notable victory coming from General James Wolfe's capture of Quebec in 1759. The 7 Years' War, from 1756 until 1763. The 7 Years' War lasted between 1756 and 1763 and showed just how far Britain was prepared to go in order to protect its colonial interest. England and France had been involved in small conflicts over territories for many years. In 1756, Britain declared war on France over a conflict over France's expansion in America by the Ohio River Valley. British Prime Minister William Pitt the Older founded the British colonies in America to raise armies against the French. By 1763, at the Treaty of Paris, Britain gained a number of new colonies in North and Central America: Canada, Dominica, Grenada, Saint Vincent, and the Grenadines and Tobago. The British victory was significant as it resulted in France supporting in America in the War of Independence just over a decade later. the first British Empire from 1760 until 1783. The 18th century saw the European empires looking to expand their influence and power in world affairs. The first British colony in what is now known as the United States was in Jamestown, Virginia in 1607. Prior to colonialization, the land belonged to the Native Americans. The Native Americans are indigenous people of Canada and the United States. The American War of Independence from 1775 and 1783, as the British Empire expanded, there became a growing independence movement amongst American colonialists. America was no longer ruled by the British King George III, and instead George Washington was chosen as its first president. The United States became the first of the colonized to win independence from the British Empire. The shape of the British Empire by 1783. By 1783, Britain has established an empire which comprised of colonies in North America, including the West Indies, and the Pacific, including New Zealand, which became a British colony following an expedition by James Cook in 1769. Trading posts in India, naval bases in the Mediterranean, Gibraltar, and Minorca. But Britain's defeat in the American War of Independence meant the loss of the American colonies. Timeline leading up to the British Empire exhibition of 1924. From 1899 until 1902, the Second Boer War, the British conquered South Africa. In 1919, the Treaty of Versailles gave Germany's colonies, which included land in Africa and China, as mandates for Britain and France to administer. 1924, the British Empire exhibition at Wembley Stadium. For some people, this exhibition showcased the strength and power of the empire. However, in Britain at this time, and especially after the Boer War, people became increasingly critical of imperialism. Attitudes of empire. Most British people at that time thought that they were doing the right thing by taking the British government and Christianity to the rest of the world, ending slavery and barbaric tradition, and bringing civilization and an international Pax Britannica, or British peace. The British generally felt that the way they lived their life was right way. Some people argued that colonies had their own cultures and traditions before arrival of the British. Others, such as the Liberal Party in Parliament, were divided over Britain using warfare to maintain and defend its empire. The war divided liberal opinion as well as some sectors of the British public who felt the war couldn't be morally justified. The British Empire was dismantled and replaced by a voluntary organization of former colonies called the Commonwealth. Most of Britain's African and Caribbean colonies achieved independence in the 19th and 16th. In 1973, Britain joined the European Economic Community and became part of a trading community based on free trade between the countries of Europe. In 1997, Britain formally handed Hong Kong back to China.
Canada 1815, until 1870. Following the American Revolution, many loyalists to Britain fled north to what is today Canada, where they were called United Empire Loyalists. Joined by mostly British colonies, they helped establish early colonies like Ontario and New Brunswick. British settlement in North America increased, and soon there were several colonies, but north and west of the early ones in the northeast of the continent. These new ones include British Columbia and Prince Edward Island. Rebellions broke out against British rule in 1837, but Britain appreciated the rebel support in 1867 by confederating the colonies into Canada, with its one Prime Minister. Although the Canada was still firmly within the British Empire, its people now enjoyed a great degree of self-rule. Canada was unique in the British Empire in that it had a French-speaking province, Quebec, which Britain and gained rule over in the 7 Years' War. The history. Canadian English owes its very existence to important historical events. The Treaty of Paris of 1763, the American Revolution of 1765 until 1783. These two events which spurred the first large group of English speakers to move to Canada, and the Industrial Revolution in Britain, which encouraged an even larger group to join them in the 19th century. This and other events determined the parents of English-speaking settlement in Canada, which in turn influenced the current form of Canadian English. The origin and westward expansion. English was first spoken in Canada in the 7th century, in seasonal fishing communities along the Atlantic coast, including the island of Newfoundland and at fur trade posts around Hudson Bay. The earliest English-speaking settlement in Western Canada also began in the early and mid 19th century. The majority of English-speaking settlement of the West was made possible by the completion of the Canadian Pacific Railway in 1885. Following the transfer of Nova Scotia to Britain under the Treaty of Utrecht 1713, permanent English-speaking settlements were established in that province, such as Halifax, founded in 1749. After the explosion of the French-speaking Acadian population in the 1750, Nova Scotia's English population was expanded with pioneers from New England. A subsequent land boom brought millions of immigrants to Canada and encouraged by Eastern Canadians to move west. The first mayors of Edmonton, Saskatoon, Regina, and Winnipeg were all from Ontario. Gallagher was from New Brunswick. The first premier of the Northwest Territories and those of the new province of Alberta and Saskatchewan were also from Ontario. It was therefore Ontario English that became the main model for the English of Western Canada, despite the diverse origin of the general population of the West.
Australia and New Zealand, 1815 until 1870. The first fleet of British convicts arrived at New South Wales, Australia in 1788 and established a British outpost and penal colony at Sydney Cove. These convicts were often petty criminals and represent the population spillover of Britain's Industrial Revolution as a result of the rapid urbanization and child crowding of British cities. Other convicts were political dissidents, particularly from Ireland. The establishment of a wool industry and the elected governorship of Laxland Macquarie were instrumental in transforming New South Wales from a notorious prison outpost into a budding civil society. Further colonies were established around the perimeter of the continent and European explorers ventured deep inland. A free colony was established at South Australia in 1836 with a vision for a province of the British Empire with political and religious freedoms. The colony became a cradle of democratic reforms. The Australian growth rulers increased prosperity and cultural diversity, and autonomous democratic parliament began to be established from the 1815 onward. The native inhabitant of Australia, called the Aborigines, lived as hunter-gatherer before European arrival. The population, never large, was largely dispossessed without treaty agreement or compensations through the 19th century by the expansion of European agriculture, and as had occurred when Europeans arrived in North and South America, faced superior European weaponry and suffered greatly from exposure to old world diseases such as smallpox, to which they had no biological immunity. From the early 19th century, New Zealand was being visited by explorers, sailors, missionaries, traders, and adventurers, and was administered by Britain from the nearby colony at New South Wales. In 1840, Britain signed the Treaty of Waitangi with the natives of New Zealand, the Maori, in which Britain gained sovereignty over the archipelago. As British settlers arrived, clashes resulted and the British fought several wars before defeating the Maori. By 1870, New Zealand had a population made up mostly of Britons and their descendants. Wool industry. The famous pastoralists John and Elizabeth MacArthur established a colonial wool industry in Australia in the early decades of the 1800s with rare Spanish sheep. Compared to growing crops, sheep could be grazed with little labor. It was the ideal agricultural product that fledgling Australian colonists could export back to England by ship without it perishing. The big challenge was actually selling it in England. The production of wool in Australia was disadvantaged from the start. Transport costs were high as it was halfway around the world from markets, and there was no infrastructure in place to bring it from the outback stations to waiting ships. The Australian climate and landscape, so much dirtier and dustier than Europe, made our wool clumpy and more difficult to sell. Outdroughts made water supply erratic and diseases were prevalent. Yet during the first half of 1800s, an amazing things happened. In 1815, Britain was getting most of its wool from its textile mills from Spain, over 3,000 tons, and Germany over 1,400 tons annually, with Australia only supplying 33 tons of wool. By 1849, this had completely turned around. The Australian colonies became the dominant supplier, selling England a staggering of 16,300 tons of wool that year. This was more than all of Europe's production combined throughout most of the 1800s. Wool was our most important export, increasing many times over. Manufacturing. Australian manufacturing was supercharged in the 1800s by the enormous scientific, engineering, communication, and transport advances occurring in Britain at the time on account of the Industrial Revolution. The first steam engine began operating in Australia in 1815, brought to Sydney by a Scottish John Dixon, who arrived in 1813. Local manufacture of small steam engines began as early as the 1830s. Australian manufacturing relied heavily on imported technology from Britain and, to a lesser extent, America. Some had to be modified for local conditions. Local manufacturers had to come to grips with a country whose resources and climate were alien. Important spinning machinery had to cope with fine merino wool, while iron and copper furnaces had to be altered to operate with the local ore impurities. Other industries faced difficulties on account of our hotter climates, which led to over-fermentation in brewing, excessive heat from millstones, grinding flour, not to mention the difficulty of transporting dairy production. This encouraged mass enterprise and a colonial can-do attitude to problem-solving developed. And the last is United States from 1817 to 1870. Following independence from Britain, the United States began expanding westward, and soon a number of new states had joined the Union. In 1803, the United States purchased the Louisiana Territory from France, whose Emperor Napoleon I had regained it from Spain. Soon, America's growing population was settling the Louisiana Territory, which geographically doubled the size of the country. At the same time, a series of revolution and independence movements in Spain and Portugal's American Empire resulted in the liberation of nearly all of Latin America. As the region composed of South America, most of the Caribbean, and North America from Mexico south became known. At first, Spain and its allies seemed ready to try to reconquer the colonies, but the US and Britain opposed this, and the reconquest never took place. From 1821 on, the US bordered the newly independent nation of Mexico. An early problem faced by the Mexican Republic was what to do with its sparsely populated northern territories, which today make up a large part of American West. The government decided to try to attract Mexicans looking for land. Americans arrived in such large numbers that both the province of Texas and California had majority white, English-speaking population. This led to a culture clash between these provinces and the rest of Mexico. When Mexico became a dictatorship under General Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna, the Texans declared independence. After several battles, Texas gained independence from Mexico, although Mexico later claimed it still had a right to Texas. After exiting as a republic modeled after the U.S. for several years, Texas joined the United States in 1845. This led to further disputes between the U.S. and Mexico, resulting in the Mexican-American Wars. The wars ended with an American victory, and Mexico had to cede all its northern territories to the United States and recognize the independence of California, which had revolted against Mexico during the war. In 1850, California joined the United States. In 1848, the U.S. and Britain resolved a border dispute over territories on the Pacific coast, called the Argent Country, by giving Britain the northern part and the U.S. the southern part. In 1867, the U.S. expanded again, purchasing the Russian colony of Alaska in northwestern North America. Politically, U.S. became more democratic with the abolishment of property requirements in voting, although voting remained restricted with white males. By the mid-19th century, the most important issue was slavery. The northern states generally had outlawed the practice, while the southern states not only had kept it legal but came to feel it was essential to their way of life. As new states joined the Union, lawmakers clashed over whether they should be slave states or free states. In 1870, the anti-slavery candidate Abraham Lincoln was elected president, fearing the would try to outlaw slavery in the whole country. Several southern states seceded, forming the Confederate States of America, electing their own president and raising their own army. Lincoln recounted that secession was illegal and raised an army to crush the rebel government. Thus, the advent of the American Civil War from 1861 until 1865. The Confederates had a skilled military that defeated of Confederation at Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, and at Vicksburg, which gave the Union control of the important Mississippi River. Union forces invaded deep into the South, and the Confederacy created General Robert Edward Lee surrendered to Ulysses S. Grant to the Union in 1865. After that, the South came under Union occupation, ending the American Civil War. Lincoln was tragically assassinated in 1865, but his dream of ending slavery, exhibited in the wartime's Emancipation Proclamation, was carried out by his Republican Party, which outlawed slavery, granted black equality and black males voting rights via constitutional amendments. I think that's all the explanation from 6th group. Thank you, and we also apologize if we had any mistake of our presentation. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.